Every now and then a book comes along whose subject matter just surprises me in the most wonderful possible way. It's typically a nonfiction book that covers some subject which I know about, but covers it in an unusual way, or covers an intersection between two things that I didn't think had an intersection. Or if they did have an intersection, I didn't really know about how they intersected. The book I'm going to talk about today is in the second category, and it's called Fashion Killer, or How Hip Hop Revolutionized High Fashion. This book came out late last year, and I saw it on the shelves at my local Barnes & Noble and was intrigued by it. I mean, it's hard not to be intrigued by cover art like that and by a slug line like that. But I did not pick it up until just very recently. And once I did, I sat down and ended up reading the whole thing in about an afternoon. It's quite a read. It is a study of how hip hop culture and high fashion have intersected and influenced each other and fed into each other quite a bit over the several decades that hip hop has been in existence. So it starts roughly in the early 1970s with a figure named Dapper Dan, who became famous for producing what were widely regarded by some as knockoffs of higher fashion products from people like Gucci, but were his own hybrid creations. And then after he was run out of business and driven underground, he eventually resurfaced, and so the very last chapter circles back to him in a nice bit of closure. But in between, there's a great deal of material about all the ways that hip hop culture and high fashion culture were now starting to interweave and feed into each other. So at the beginning, it started off mostly from the way that the author describes it as being a case of uh, what could be described as being appropriative, where mainstream culture would look to hip hop culture as a way to spice things up, and they would often do it in a way that was quite inaccurate, that wasn't really designed to appeal to the very people that hip hop culture was all about. It was designed to appeal to mainstream America. But over time, as hip hop started to become much more mainstream and much more widely understood and accepted and celebrated, the fusion between high fashion and hip hop started to become that much more natural. And they started to feed into each other that much more thoroughly. You had people like Anna Wintour and Donatella Versace and Tommy Hilfiger and Ralph Lauren all suddenly becoming presences in the hip hop world and vice versa. And the book, for those of you who don't know about the scene in general, there's a fair amount of background detail, as to the significance of this particular figure, that particular figure. So if you don't know too much about either high fashion or hip hop, you can probably walk into the book cold and get a great deal out of it. If you already know those things, it'll be even more enriching because you'll probably see a lot of detail elicited that you hadn't originally known about before. So the reason that I found this interesting for this channel is because I've been thinking a great deal about how every setting, whether fantasy or science fiction, every setting of the fantastic will have different aspects to it. There will be a center of the culture, there'll be fringes to the culture, and there will be the way that the center and the fringes meet and interpenetrate and feed into each other. And I'm always fascinated by that process, by the way things that were considered either criminal or avant-garde or subterranean or just, déclassé, can turn around and suddenly become the center of attention. They can suddenly become the next big thing. They can become a cause célèbre, you name it. And seeing how this process works in real life, for me, is a good place to start when you want to look at how something like that could be put into a setting that you're creating. So if you're thinking at all about how a fantasy or science fiction setting could have a little bit of that flavor, this is one of a number of books that I can recommend on that score for exactly that reason, because it details this process of interpenetration from both sides in a real world example. It shows how originally the interface between high culture and hip hop culture was kind of iffy from both directions, but started to become more natural, started to become much more passionate on both sides, and all of the cultural context behind how that happened. So again, it's not as if the setting that you're coming up with has to use hip hop culture as a reference point or use high fashion as a reference point. The point is to get an idea by way of analogy, by way of looking at how things like this have interfaced in the past, where you have the center and the fringes, or you have high and low, or you have some other set of opposites that are drawn together, and that out of that drawing together come new and interesting things and a transformation in the culture generally. So that's my, I hope, not too confusing reason why I think this would be worth investigating if you're interested in the sociology of a science fiction or fantasy setting from that viewpoint. And it's also a great read. If you're even remotely curious about either of those subjects, about high fashion or hip hop, absolutely pick this up. It's available both in Kindle and digitally. The reading experience is equally good in both. But I do have to say, the physical edition looks fantastic on a shelf. I know I'm going to be hanging on to this for quite a while. So that's what I think. See you around.